Good afternoon, my name is Jacqueline Renteria, and today I will be discussing the significance of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. On page 437 of Oaks of the People, it says that by the time Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, the Union had been freeing slaves, and slaves were freeing themselves for more than a year, but the pace quickened at once with the start of the Civil War and later the Reconstruction era. Having divided the country for 4 years, many new changes stemmed from the cause of the war and the official ending of the war. However, contrary to what anti-slavery supporters wanted the war to do, it simply accomplished making slavery illegal, but it did not completely free the slaves. The Reconstruction era was particularly hard for African Americans because they had no idea what to do in the country they had been held prisoner for so long. They were still suppressed, but they weren't slaves anymore. Both of these events greatly impacted the development of the country because the Civil War abolished slavery, an institution that began at the first settlement of Jamestown, and Reconstruction solidified the notion that all men were created equal and were allowed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race or color. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, and lasted until May 9, 1865. The primary causes of the war include slavery, state rights, conflicting economic interests, and the preservation of the Union, mostly by President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was forced to change his angle when the South seceded, and so he had to use military force to bring them back together. The Union ultimately wins, and the Confederacy is forced to comply with the new rules set by the federal government. While the Southern states believed they were fighting a war over state rights, both sides knew the real reason was the right to their which included slavery. The institution of slavery was too rough of a situation to touch on, and so for years no one said a thing. Even the North profited from the trade, but their country could not extend slavery into the other parts of states. However, the South seen this as a threat because their economy relied heavily on slavery. During the war, Lincoln kept on sending in soldiers faster than the South could keep them. As a result, most of the Southern men were dying of infections, starvation, and other illnesses, even though the Union kept on prevailing. The Civil War aided in the development of the political and social life of the United States. Although the war was bloody and gruesome, the Union soldiers paved way for the 13th Amendment, which would ban slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which would grant citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. The Civil War's intent to rid slavery was victorious up to a point because even though slavery was made illegal, African American slaves would need years before they felt truly free in the land. The next era of Reconstruction harbored much hope, but also a lot of violence. Lincoln constructed his 10% plan in an effort to bring the nation back together. He proposed a lenient plan in order to admit the South back. He wanted 10% of all states to pledge allegiance to the United States. Slavery would be abolished, and he would grant pardons to everyone except high-ranking Confederates. According to the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, the South was divided into 5 military districts and governed by military governors until acceptable state constitutions could be written and approved by Congress. However, with Andrew Johnson on the pedestal making the decisions, he was able to pass many constitutions before Congress approved them. In addition to this, black codes were eventually created as a means to keep African Americans from receiving the same rights as white men in the South. Northern carpetbaggers took this opportunity to buy up a lot of the land of the South, knowing that most of it would be burned down or destroyed, so they would get it for cheap prices. In addition to this, the Freedmen's Bureau was created in order to help freed slaves find jobs, own land, get food and supplies, and basically enter society. However, most of the time, these laws were overlooked. According to the Freedmen's Bureau, there is a man who was accused of cutting a woman on her head, her side, and her arms with a knife, and otherwise hurting her and maltreating her. However, authorities still did nothing. He was arrested, brought in, but then when he went to the civil authorities for a trial, he was released. Looking at situations like this, it was obvious that African Americans weren't in favor with the white superiority of men. It is evident that even though civil liberties were trying to be enforced, people still found ways over them in order to hurt and stop the Freedmen's Bureau. Meetings were disturbed by riots, and many significant leaders of the cause were beaten or even killed.